I was sitting at the counter of Roselli's Italian restaurant, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, when I witnessed something that would haunt me for years afterward, though not for the reasons you might expect. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn, the kind of night when darkness comes early and the wind carries the smell of coming rain through streets that never quite empty in this part of the city. Roselli's had been a neighborhood institution for 43 years, the kind of place where 3 generations of families celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where the red sauce recipe was a closely guarded secret, where the walls were covered with framed photographs documenting decades of community history. The restaurant occupied a corner building with large windows that faced 2 streets, its interior warm and inviting, with red checkered tablecloths and candlelight that created shadows dancing across the ceiling. I'd been coming here since childhood, back when old Giovanni Roselli himself would work the dining room, greeting customers like family, remembering their usual orders, and asking about their kids by name. Giovanni had died 6 months earlier, leaving the restaurant to his widow Angela, a woman of 71 who'd worked alongside her husband for their entire marriage and knew every aspect of the business, from the kitchen to the books. Angela Roselli was behind the counter when it started, counting out the cash register at the end of the dinner service, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her silver hair pulled back in the same bun she'd worn for as long as I could remember. She moved with the careful deliberation of age, each motion considered, her hands showing the arthritis that came from decades of cooking and cleaning and carrying heavy trays. The restaurant was nearly empty, just me at the counter, an elderly couple finishing dessert in the corner booth, and 2 of the kitchen staff cleaning up in the back. The quiet was comfortable, the kind of peaceful ending to a workday that felt earned after hours of serving customers and managing the controlled chaos of a busy kitchen. That peace shattered when Marcus Bryant walked through the door, bringing with him an energy that was immediately threatening, a presence that made the temperature in the room feel like it had dropped 10 degrees. I recognized him from the neighborhood mid-30s, built like someone who spent serious time in the gym, always dressed in expensive athletic wear that announced money acquired through means no one quite wanted to investigate too closely. He had a reputation as a developer's enforcer, the kind of man sent to convince reluctant business owners to sell their properties when polite negotiation failed. Marcus didn't sit down or wait to be greeted. He walked directly to the counter where Angela stood, his posture aggressive, his voice loud enough to carry through the entire restaurant. He told Angela that she'd received several offers to sell the property, fair offers that reflected current market values, and that continuing to refuse those offers was becoming problematic for people who didn't like their time being wasted. He spoke like he was doing her a favor by explaining this, like she should be grateful for his patience in coming to clarify the situation personally. Angela looked up from her cash drawer with an expression that mixed confusion and growing alarm, clearly not understanding why this stranger was in her restaurant, making what sounded increasingly like threats. She told him politely that the restaurant wasn't for sale, that it was her home and her livelihood, that she'd worked too hard for too many years to give it up just because someone decided the property was valuable. Her voice shook slightly, betraying the fear she was trying to hide, but she stood her ground with a dignity that made my chest tighten with admiration and concern. Marcus laughed at her response, a harsh sound with no humor in it, and told her that she was being stupid, that old women like her couldn't run restaurants alone, that she'd be better off taking the money and moving somewhere cheaper where she wouldn't be a burden on anyone. The disrespect in Marcus's voice was visceral, designed to humiliate and intimidate, to make Angela feel small and powerless in her own establishment. He leaned across the counter, invading her space, his physical size and proximity, creating an implicit threat that didn't need to be stated explicitly to be understood. He told her she had 2 weeks to accept the current offer, and if she didn't, the next offer would be substantially lower and would come with consequences for her stubbornness. He said the word consequences with emphasis, making sure she understood it wasn't just about money, but about her safety and the restaurant's continued ability to operate. Then, in what seemed like a calculated act of dominance, Marcus reached out and swept his arm across the counter, knocking Angela's cash drawer and calculator to the floor. Bills and coins scattered across the tile, the calculator breaking open and spilling batteries. Angela gasped and stepped back, one hand going to her chest, her face pale with shock. Marcus smiled at her reaction, satisfied with the fear he'd created, and turned to leave. As he passed my spot at the counter, our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw in his face the casual cruelty of someone who enjoyed causing pain, who felt powerful only when making others feel weak. I looked away, ashamed of my own cowardice, hating myself for sitting there watching without intervening, without doing anything to help Angela beyond bearing silent witness to her humiliation. After Marcus left, the restaurant remained frozen in shocked silence for several long seconds. Then, Angela slowly bent down to begin gathering the scattered money, her movements stiff and painful, her hands shaking badly enough that she had trouble picking up the coins. I got up immediately and knelt beside her, helping collect the cash and damaged calculator, murmuring apologies for not doing something sooner, for not standing up to Marcus when he was terrorizing her. Angela thanked me quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, clearly shaken but trying to maintain composure. The elderly couple from the corner booth came over to help as well, the husband expressing outrage at what they'd just witnessed, asking if Angela wanted them to call the police. Angela shook her head, saying there was no point, that men like Marcus didn't leave evidence, and the police wouldn't do anything about verbal threats and a knocked-over cash drawer. She'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to understand how power worked, to know that official channels often failed people like her who lacked connections and resources. We helped her to her feet and watched as she locked the money in the safe, her routine movements now mechanical, performed on autopsy, while her mind processed what had just happened and what it meant for her future. I stayed after the other customers left, helping Angela close up the restaurant, sweeping the floor and wiping down tables while she reconciled the night's receipts. She worked in silence, and I didn't try to force conversation, sensing she needed time to think through her options and gather herself emotionally. Finally, as she was putting on her coat to leave, she told me something that changed the entire context of what I'd witnessed. She said that Giovanni had built this restaurant from nothing, that they'd borrowed money from dangerous people to get started back in the 1972, when banks wouldn't lend to Italian immigrants with no credit history and heavy accents. Those dangerous people had owned a piece of the restaurant for years, taking their percentage quietly, providing protection in exchange for their investment. But Giovanni had slowly bought them out over decades, finally owning the property free and clear about 10 years before his death. Angela said this with a kind of weary pride, explaining that they'd worked their entire lives to be independent, to owe nothing to anyone, to leave their children something that was truly theirs. The idea of selling now, of letting developers demolish the restaurant and build luxury condos, of erasing everything she and Giovanni had built, it was unthinkable. She'd rather die than give up, she said, even though she knew that stubbornness might get her hurt or worse. I walked Angela to her car that night, watching until she drove away, then stood on the sidewalk, looking back at Roselli's through its large windows. The restaurant looked vulnerable in the darkness, its warmth and history seeming fragile against the forces that wanted to erase it for profit. I thought about Marcus Bryant and the people he worked for, about the systematic displacement of long-time residents and business owners that was transforming the neighborhood into something unrecognizable. I thought about power and powerlessness, about elderly widows trying to hold on to their life's work while facing threats from men who viewed them as obstacles rather than human beings deserving of respect and dignity. And I thought about my own cowardice, my failure to intervene, my learned helplessness in the face of injustice that seemed too big and too dangerous to confront directly. I went home that night, feeling sick with anger and shame, unable to shake the image of Angela's shaking hands, picking up scattered coins, while Marcus Bryant walked away satisfied with the fear he'd created. I didn't sleep well, kept replaying the scene, thinking about what I should have done differently, wondering if there was anyone who could help Angela, anyone with enough power to stand up to developers and their enforcers. The next morning, I learned something about Giovanni Roselli that I'd never known despite eating at his restaurant for 30 years. I was having breakfast at a diner 2 blocks from Roselli's when I overheard a conversation between 2 older men at the next table. They were discussing Marcus Bryant's visit to the restaurant, news of which had apparently spread quickly through neighborhood networks. One of them said it was a shame what was happening to Angela, that Giovanni would be turning in his grave knowing his wife was being threatened. The other man responded that Giovanni had friends who wouldn't be happy about this situation, powerful friends who'd been at the funeral, friends from the old days who remembered debts and loyalties that didn't end with death. The way he said friends carried weight, implied connections that went beyond casual acquaintance. My curiosity overwhelmed my usual reluctance to eavesdrop, obviously, and I turned to ask what they meant by powerful friends. The 2 men looked at me appraisingly, clearly debating whether to explain or tell me to mind my own business. Finally, one of them said that Giovanni Roselli hadn't just been a restaurateur. In his younger days, before he'd gone legitimate, Giovanni had been connected to the Marchesi family, one of the most powerful organized crime organizations in the city. He'd done work for them, been trusted by them, maintained relationships even after he'd left that life to focus on his restaurant. The Marchesi family had shown respect by sending representatives to Giovanni's funeral, had sent flowers and condolences that Angela probably hadn't fully understood the significance of. This information recontextualized everything I'd witnessed the night before. Marcus Bryant had walked into that restaurant completely unaware that he was threatening a woman under the protection of one of the most dangerous crime families in the city. He'd assumed Angela was just another elderly widow with no resources and no one to defend her, easy prey for intimidation tactics that had probably worked countless times before. But if what these men were saying was true, Angela wasn't as isolated and vulnerable as she appeared. Whether she knew it or not, whether she'd asked for it or not, the Marchesi family would almost certainly learn about Marcus's visit and his threats against Giovanni's widow. And when they learned about it, they would respond in ways that Marcus and his employers couldn't anticipate or prepare for, because they operated in a world of contracts and permits and legal frameworks, while the Marchesi family operated according to older codes about respect and loyalty and the consequences of disrespecting someone under their protection. I finished my breakfast quickly and went back to Roselli's, wanting to warn Angela, though I wasn't sure what exactly I was warning her about or whether my warning would be welcome. I found the restaurant closed, a handwritten sign on the door saying it would reopen for dinner service that evening, and Angela nowhere to be seen. I returned that evening when Roselli's opened at 5 o'clock. The restaurant was busier than usual, word having spread about Marcus's visit, neighborhood residents showing solidarity by eating dinner at Angela's place, making sure she knew the community supported her. Angela moved through the dining room with her usual grace, despite what must have been enormous stress, taking orders and delivering plates, accepting words of encouragement from customers who'd been coming to her restaurant for decades. I took a seat at my usual spot at the counter, ordered the lasagna, and watched the room fill up with familiar faces, people who understood that supporting local businesses was a form of resistance against the forces trying to erase neighborhood character and history. The atmosphere was defiant, almost festive, a community gathering around one of their own in her time of need. But I noticed Angela's eyes kept drifting to the front window, clearly worried that Marcus might return, that the harassment would escalate, that she'd face more threats in front of the customers she was trying to serve with dignity and normalcy. I wanted to tell her what I'd learned that morning about Giovanni's connections, about the protection she might have, whether she realized it or not. But something held me back. Maybe the understanding that discussing such matters in a crowded restaurant was unwise, or maybe fear of saying too much about things I didn't fully understand. Around 7:30, a black Cadillac pulled up outside the restaurant, parking directly in front of the main window where everyone inside could see it clearly. The conversations in the dining room gradually quieted as people noticed the car, its presence announcing significance before anyone emerged. The driver got out first, a large man in an expensive suit, moving with the careful awareness of professional security. He opened the rear passenger door, and an older gentleman stepped out, probably in his mid-70s. Dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit with a silk tie, his white hair perfectly styled, his face weathered but still handsome. He moved with a certain authority, the kind of presence that comes from decades of commanding respect and wielding power. Several of the older customers in Roselli's immediately recognized him. I could see it in their faces, in the way they straightened up and nudged their companions to look. This was Salvatore Marchesi, the patriarch of the Marchesi crime family, a man whose name carried weight in both legitimate and criminal circles throughout the city. He'd semi-retired years ago, leaving day-to-day operations to his sons, but he was still the ultimate authority, the final decision-maker, whose word was law within his organization. His appearance at Roselli's was unprecedented, shocking, and clearly significant in ways that would take time to fully understand. Salvatore Marchesi entered the restaurant with his security following at a respectful distance. He walked directly to the counter where Angela stood frozen, her eyes wide with recognition and something that might have been fear or relief or confusion. Salvatore removed his hat and held it against his chest in a gesture of old-fashioned respect, then spoke to Angela in Italian, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent restaurant. I didn't speak Italian well enough to understand everything he said, but I caught enough words to grasp the essential meaning. He was expressing condolences for Giovanni's death, acknowledging that he should have visited sooner, explaining that he'd only recently learned of disrespect being shown to Giovanni's widow. His tone was formal, respectful, almost gentle, treating Angela with a deference that seemed at odds with his reputation, but was clearly genuine. Angela responded in Italian, her voice shaking with emotion, thanking him for coming, saying she didn't want to be trouble for anyone. Salvatore shook his head firmly, placing his hand over his heart in a gesture that emphasized sincerity. He told her switching to English now, so everyone in the restaurant could understand that Giovanni Roselli had been his friend, that friends looked after each other's families, that any disrespect shown to her was disrespect shown to Giovanni's memory, and would not be tolerated. The declaration hung in the air, a promise and a threat rolled together, everyone present understanding the implications. Salvatore asked Angela to describe what had happened the previous evening, who had come to her restaurant, what threats had been made. Angela hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was taking, not wanting to cause violence or draw the restaurant deeper into matters that frightened her. But Salvatore waited patiently, his expression kind but expectant, making clear that this wasn't optional, that he needed to know what had happened in order to address it properly. Finally, Angela described Marcus Bryant's visit in halting sentences, explaining about the pressure to sell the property, about Marcus knocking her cash drawer to the floor, about the 2-week ultimatum and implied threats. As she spoke, I watched Salvatore's face darken with anger that was all the more frightening for being completely controlled. When Angela finished, Salvatore nodded slowly, then told her that she would not be bothered again, that her restaurant was under protection now, that anyone who threatened her would answer to him personally. He said this loudly enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear, ensuring that word would spread, that the neighborhood would know. Angela Roselli was not alone and not vulnerable, that threatening her carried consequences that most people would desperately want to avoid. Before leaving, Salvatore asked Angela if he could see the kitchen, explaining that he wanted to pay his respects to the place where Giovanni had created his famous sauce, had worked so many years building something good. Angela led him through the dining room to the kitchen doors, and I watched through the pass-through window as Salvatore stood in the middle of that workspace, his eyes traveling over the stoves and prep tables, his hand resting briefly on the counter where Giovanni must have stood thousands of times. It was a moment of genuine emotion from a man not known for public displays of sentiment, a powerful crime boss paying respects to an old friend in the place that had represented that friend's legitimate dream. When Salvatore emerged from the kitchen, his eyes were slightly wet, though his composure remained perfect. He said goodbye to Angela, telling her to call the number his driver would leave if she had any problems, any concerns, anything at all. Then he left as he'd arrived, with quiet dignity and obvious authority, getting into his Cadillac and driving away while the entire restaurant watched in stunned silence. After his departure, the dining room erupted into excited conversation, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed, debating what it meant, speculating about what would happen next. Angela stood at the counter, looking dazed, holding the business card Salvatore's driver had pressed into her hand, probably wondering how her life had become so complicated so quickly. I finished my lasagna and paid my bill, leaving Angela a generous tip and telling her I was glad she had friends looking out for her. She gave me a weak smile, clearly overwhelmed by everything that was happening, uncertain whether Salvatore's intervention was salvation or just a different kind of problem. As I left Roselli's that night, I thought about power and protection, about debts and loyalties that extended beyond death, about communities and how they defend themselves when official systems fail them. I thought about Marcus Bryant, who had no idea what consequences his casual cruelty had set in motion, who'd gone home after threatening Angela, probably feeling satisfied with his intimidation tactics, not knowing that he'd drawn the attention of people far more dangerous than he could imagine. And I thought about Angela, caught between developers who wanted her property and criminals who'd decided to protect her, neither option giving her the simple independence and peace she'd earned after a lifetime of hard work. The situation was messy and complicated, full of moral ambiguities that didn't resolve into clear categories of right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice. But at least Angela wasn't alone anymore. At least someone with real power had decided she mattered, even if that power came from sources she'd probably prefer not to be indebted to. Marcus Bryant returned to Roselli's exactly 1 week later, apparently unaware of or unconcerned about Salvatore Marchese's visit. He walked in during the dinner rush, the restaurant full of customers, Angela's 2 waitresses carrying plates and taking orders, the kitchen staff working steadily behind the swinging doors. I happened to be there again, whether by coincidence or because I'd developed a morbid compulsion to witness whatever came next, I couldn't say. Marcus approached Angela at the counter with the same aggressive posture he'd displayed the previous week, clearly intending to escalate his pressure campaign, to make good on his threats about consequences for her continued refusal to sell. He started speaking loudly, berating Angela for wasting his time, telling her the new offer was half of what she'd been offered before, emphasizing that her stubbornness was going to cost her everything she'd worked for. Angela stood very still, her face pale but her expression composed, holding the business card Salvatore had given her like a talisman. She told Marcus quietly that the restaurant wasn't for sale at any price, that she had friends who'd advised her not to engage with his offers any further, that he should leave before creating a scene that would embarrass them both. Marcus laughed at her presumed threats, asking what kind of friends an old woman could have that would worry him or the people he represented. The question was rhetorical, dismissive, intended to mock Angela's attempt at standing up to him. He never got to finish his intimidation routine. The front door of Roselli's opened and 3 men entered, moving with synchronized purpose that suggested professional coordination. They weren't loud or aggressive, didn't announce themselves, or make any immediate threats. They simply walked directly to where Marcus stood at the counter, positioned themselves around him in a way that was clearly confrontational, and waited. Marcus looked at them with growing confusion that shifted rapidly into recognition and then fear, as he apparently realized who they were and what their presence meant. One of the men, the oldest, probably in his 50s, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen and done things most people couldn't imagine, spoke to Marcus in a tone that was conversational but carried unmistakable menace. He introduced himself as Salvatore Marchese's nephew, said he'd heard Marcus had been bothering Mrs. Roselli expressed disappointment that someone would show such disrespect in the establishment that was under their family's protection. The word protection was emphasized carefully, making clear this wasn't a casual relationship, but a formal arrangement with serious implications. Marcus started to respond, probably intending to explain or justify or negotiate. But the nephew cut him off with a simple gesture, raising one hand slightly to indicate silence was preferred. The message was clear. Marcus's opinions and explanations were irrelevant. His opportunity to speak had passed. He was now simply receiving information about how things were going to proceed. The nephew explained to Marcus that Mrs. Roselli would not be selling her property, that no further offers should be made, that any continued pressure or harassment would be considered a personal insult to the Marchese family. He delivered this information calmly, almost kindly, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. He added that Marcus should communicate this new situation to his employers, help them understand that pursuing this particular property was no longer viable or advisable, save everyone the unpleasantness of having to reinforce these boundaries more dramatically. Marcus nodded numbly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, his face showing the pallor of someone experiencing genuine fear for the first time in a long time. The nephew then turned to Angela, his demeanor shifting to respectful deference, and apologized for the disruption to her dinner service, assured her that Marcus would not be returning, wished her a pleasant evening. The three men left as smoothly as they'd arrived, Marcus stumbling after them, clearly having been dismissed and expected to follow. Through the restaurant's front window, I watched them escort Marcus to a car parked half a block away, saw one of them speaking to Marcus for several minutes with animated gestures, saw Marcus getting progressively smaller and more frightened as whatever message was being delivered sank in. Finally, they released him, and Marcus practically ran to his own car and drove away, his humiliation complete and public, his reputation as an enforcer probably destroyed by his visible fear in front of witnesses. The restaurant returned to normal slowly, customers gradually resuming their meals and conversations, though the energy in the room had shifted into something charged and excited, everyone processing what they'd witnessed and what it meant. Angela stood at the counter, looking shaken, but also relieved, the tension she'd been carrying for 2 weeks visibly draining from her shoulders. Several customers stopped by to congratulate her on having such powerful friends, to express relief that the threat had been addressed, to order celebratory desserts and additional drinks in honor of her victory over developers and their enforcers. Angela accepted their congratulations graciously, but without enthusiasm, clearly understanding that what had just happened wasn't entirely positive, that being under the Marchese family's protection came with obligations and associations she'd never wanted for herself or her restaurant. But she also understood that refusing their protection wasn't really an option, that Salvatore had made a decision based on his friendship with Giovanni, that she was now part of a system of debts and loyalties, whether she'd chosen that or not. I caught her eye across the restaurant and saw in her expression a complicated mixture of gratitude and resignation, relief and apprehension, the acknowledgement that she'd been saved from one threat, but was now connected to forces that carried their own dangers and moral complications. Marcus Bryant never returned to the neighborhood after that night. I heard through various sources that he'd lost his job with the development company, that his reputation as an effective enforcer had been destroyed by his visible fear and failure at Roselli's, that he'd left the city entirely after receiving additional visits and warnings from people associated with the Marchese family. The development company itself abandoned its pursuit of the property where Roselli's was located, moving on to other projects, other neighborhoods where resistance would be less organized and less protected. Angela continued running her restaurant, which experienced a surge in business as the story of her protection spread and people came to eat at the place that had stood up to developers with the help of organized crime. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A small business saved from displacement by criminals, protected through intimidation and violence after legal channels had proven inadequate. It was a victory that felt hollow in some ways, achieved through methods that couldn't be celebrated publicly or held up as a model for how communities should resist exploitation. But it was still a victory, still meant that Angela kept her restaurant and her livelihood, still meant that not every development project succeeded in erasing neighborhood history in favor of luxury housing. Over the following months, I watched as the relationship between Angela and the Marchese family settled into a pattern. Salvatore never returned to the restaurant personally, but various family members became regular customers, always treated with obvious deference by other patrons who understood the dynamics at play. They ate their meals, paid their bills generously, never caused any trouble, or drew attention to themselves beyond their presence being noteworthy. It was a subtle form of ongoing protection, their regular appearance sending a message to anyone who might consider threatening Angela or her business. Angela served them with the same courtesy she showed all customers, neither fawning over their presence nor showing resentment at the complicated position their protection had put her in. She maintained her dignity and her independence within the constraints of a relationship she hadn't chosen but had learned to navigate. The restaurant itself became something of a neighborhood symbol, proof that resistance to displacement was possible even if the methods of that resistance were morally complicated. People pointed to Roselli's when discussing development pressures, citing it as evidence that not everything had to change, that some things could be preserved even in the face of enormous economic forces pushing transformation. I continued eating at Roselli's regularly, watching as months turned into years, and the restaurant remained while so many others around it closed or were forced out. The neighborhood changed dramatically over that time, property values soaring, long-time residents displaced, new residents moving in with different expectations and priorities. But Roselli's persisted, an island of continuity in a sea of transformation, protected by forces that newcomers didn't understand and long-time residents rarely discussed openly. Angela aged visibly under the stress of running the business alone, her arthritis worsening, her movements becoming more labored, but she refused to retire or sell, determined to maintain what she and Giovanni had built for as long as she was physically capable. I often wondered what Giovanni would think of how things had turned out, whether he'd approve of his old connections being activated to protect his widow, whether he'd see it as his past life redeeming itself through one last act of loyalty, or whether he'd regret that Angela had been drawn into associations with the Marchese family that he'd spent decades trying to leave behind. There was no way to know, no way to ask, just the ongoing reality of a widow running a restaurant under the protection of organized crime, because that was the only protection available when she needed it. I was there the night Angela finally decided to retire, about 4 years after Marcus Bryant's initial threats and Salvatore Marchese's intervention. She was 75 years old, her health declining, the physical demands of running a restaurant finally too much for her to manage, even with help from loyal staff. She announced her decision to the dining room full of regular customers, many of whom had been eating at Roselli's for decades, some since childhood. There were tears and protests, people begging her to reconsider, offering to help more with the business operations, suggesting her children or grandchildren could take over management. Angela listened to all of this with obvious emotion but firm resolution, explaining that her children had their own careers and lives, that running a restaurant required passion and commitment she could no longer provide, that it was time to let go while she could still make the decision on her own terms, rather than waiting until health crisis forced the issue. She thanked everyone for their years of patronage and loyalty, for supporting the restaurant through its various crises, for making her life's work meaningful and valued. The speech was simple and heartfelt, delivered in Angela's accented English that had never fully lost the rhythms of her native Italian despite 50 years in America. When she finished, the entire restaurant applauded, standing ovation that lasted several minutes, while Angela stood behind the counter, crying openly, overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection and appreciation. The question of what would happen to the property and the business was resolved through channels I didn't fully understand, but could partly guess. The building was purchased by a corporation that turned out to be owned by the Marchese family, who then leased the space to one of Angela's longtime kitchen staff members who wanted to continue operating the restaurant. Roselli's remained Roselli's. The menu stayed largely the same. The photographs on the walls were preserved. The recipes were maintained as closely as possible to Giovanni's originals. Angela received enough money from the sale to live comfortably for the rest of her life, probably substantially more than market value. The Marchese family, ensuring that Giovanni's widow was provided for in recognition of old friendship and loyalty. It was as happy an ending as could be expected, given all the circumstances. Better than what would have happened if Marcus Bryant and his development company had prevailed. Achieved through a network of power and protection that operated parallel to and often more effectively than official legal and economic systems. Whether this represented justice or just a different form of exploitation, whether Angela was truly free or just obligated to different masters, whether the neighborhood was better or worse for having organized crime protecting certain businesses from displacement, these were questions with complicated answers that depended on your perspective and your values and your understanding of how power actually works in communities that exist at the margins of legal and economic systems. I still go to Roselli's occasionally, though it's not quite the same without Angela behind the counter or Giovanni working the dining room. The new owner does his best to maintain the atmosphere and quality that made the restaurant special, and he's largely succeeded in preserving its character even as the neighborhood around it continues transforming. The Marchese family members still eat there regularly, their presence a reminder of the arrangements that keep the restaurant operating in a building that would otherwise have been demolished for luxury condos years ago. Newer residents, who don't know the history, probably wonder why these particular men are treated with such deference by older patrons, why their meals are sometimes comped by management, why the atmosphere shifts slightly whenever they're present. But long-time residents understand, carry the story of Angela and Marcus and Salvatore, pass it along as part of the neighborhood's oral history, a parable about power and protection, and the complicated ways communities resist displacement when official systems fail them. It's not a story with clear morals or simple lessons, not a tale of heroes defeating villains, just a complicated narrative about survival and loyalty, and the messy reality of how things actually work in neighborhoods where organized crime has been interwoven with community life for generations. The last time I saw Angela was about 2 years after her retirement. I ran into her at the Italian bakery 3 blocks from the old restaurant location. She was buying cannoli, moving slowly with a cane, but still maintaining that dignity that had always characterized her bearing. We talked briefly about how she was doing, about her grandchildren, about the restaurant continuing under new management. She seemed at peace, genuinely happy to be free of the daily stress of running a business, while also maintaining pride that her life's work continued operating. I asked her if she ever regretted how things had worked out, if she wished she'd handled the situation with Marcus differently, if she was comfortable with the Marchese family's ongoing involvement in the restaurant. Angela looked at me for a long moment before responding, her eyes showing the wisdom that comes from living through hard times and making difficult choices. She said that Giovanni always told her the world was complicated, that good people sometimes needed help from people who weren't entirely good, that survival sometimes required accepting protection from sources you'd prefer to remain independent from. She'd learned that Giovanni was right about this, she continued, that ideological purity was a luxury for people who weren't facing real threats to their survival and their life's work. The Marchese family had protected her when no one else could or would, she said simply, and whatever moral complications that created, she was grateful to still have her restaurant operating rather than demolished, still have her community gathering place rather than luxury condos, still have Giovanni's legacy preserved rather than erased. That gratitude didn't mean she approved of everything the Marchesi family did or represented, didn't mean she thought organized crime was a solution to community problems, just meant she accepted the complicated reality of having been saved by people whose protection came with costs and obligations she hadn't chosen but had learned to live with. It was the most honest answer anyone could give about situations that defied simple moral categorization, situations where every option carried costs, and where choosing not to choose was itself a choice with consequences. I think about that conversation sometimes when I pass Roselli's and see it still operating, still serving the red sauce Giovanni perfected over 43 years, still providing a gathering place for neighborhood residents old and new. I think about Angela and Giovanni, about the life they built together, and the complicated forces that allowed it to continue after Giovanni's death. I think about Marcus Bryant and the casual cruelty that set everything in motion, the confidence of someone who thought elderly widows were easy targets, who didn't understand the networks of loyalty and obligation that existed beneath the neighborhood's surface. I think about Salvatore Marchesi and the codes of honor and friendship that motivated his intervention, about how organized crime can simultaneously exploit communities and protect them, how the same people can be both predators and defenders depending on context and relationships. These contradictions don't resolve, don't simplify into clear narratives about good and evil or justice and injustice. They just exist as part of the complicated reality of urban neighborhoods, where power operates at multiple levels through multiple systems, where official institutions often fail vulnerable people who then seek or receive protection from unofficial sources, where survival sometimes requires accepting help from people you wouldn't choose as allies under different circumstances. The story of Roselli's is the story of countless other small businesses and families navigating these same dynamics, making similar compromises, surviving through networks of mutual aid and obligation that fall outside conventional understandings of how communities are supposed to function. Whether that represents something to celebrate or something to mourn, whether it shows resilience or exploitation, whether it demonstrates the failure of legal systems or the persistence of alternative justice, these are questions each person has to answer for themselves, based on their own values and experiences and understanding of how the world actually works versus how we wish it worked. About 5 years after Angela's retirement, I learned what had happened to Marcus Bryant following his humiliating ejection from Roselli's that evening. The information came to me through an unexpected source, a journalist working on a long-form piece about organized crime's relationship with urban development and neighborhood displacement. She'd tracked me down through interviews with other Roselli's regulars, people who'd mentioned my presence at key moments in the restaurant's confrontation with developers. We met at a coffee shop far from the old neighborhood, neutral territory where we could talk without drawing attention or making anyone uncomfortable. The journalist, whose name was Rebecca Chen, had spent 2 years investigating how organized crime families in the city had positioned themselves as both obstacles to and facilitators of gentrification, depending on their interests and relationships. She documented cases where mob-connected businesses resisted development pressures successfully, while other mob operations actively participated in displacement schemes that generated enormous profits. Marcus Bryant featured in her research as a cautionary tale, she explained. Someone whose career and life had been destroyed because he'd failed to understand the complexity of the systems he was operating within, because he'd assumed elderly widow meant powerless victim, and had paid catastrophically for that miscalculation. Rebecca showed me documents she'd obtained through various sources: court records, property transactions, police reports, interviews with people who'd known Marcus or worked with him. The picture that emerged was both sad and predictable. a man who'd built his identity around being an enforcer, around inspiring fear, who'd lost everything when that identity was publicly demolished. After his confrontation with the Marchesi family representatives at Roselli's, Marcus had been fired from his position with the development company, his employers recognizing that someone who'd attracted that kind of attention from organized crime was a liability they couldn't afford. He'd tried to find similar work with other firms, but word had spread through the tight-knit community of people who specialized in aggressive real estate tactics, and no one would hire him. More than that, Rebecca explained, the Marchesi family had apparently decided that simply removing Marcus from Angela's situation wasn't sufficient punishment for the disrespect he'd shown. They'd systematically destroyed his ability to work in any capacity that involved intimidation or enforcement, spreading word through their networks that Marcus was unreliable, that he'd backed down when challenged, that hiring him would be seen as an insult to the Marchesi family's authority. It was a form of professional and reputational assassination that was more devastating than physical violence would have been, erasing Marcus's identity and leaving him alive to experience the full weight of his failure. Marcus had moved to Philadelphia about 6 months after the Roselli's incident, Rebecca continued, trying to start over in a city where his reputation hadn't preceded him, and where the Marchesi family's influence was less absolute. He'd found work in construction, legitimate labor that paid a fraction of what he'd made as a developer's enforcer, but at least provided income and didn't require the swagger and intimidation that had been his stock in trade. But even in Philadelphia, somehow, the word had reached people who mattered. Marcus had been let go from that construction job after 3 months, no explanation given, just a pink slip and instructions to clear out his locker. He'd bounced between various manual labor positions for the next year, each job lasting a few months at most before he'd be mysteriously terminated or laid off. It seemed impossible that the Marchesi family would care enough to actively pursue someone across state lines for such a minor infraction, but Rebecca suggested their involvement might be more passive word, simply spreading through criminal networks that Marcus Bryant was marked, that associating with him carried risks, that employers should think carefully before keeping him on payroll. Whether this was deliberate, ongoing punishment, or just the natural consequence of having been publicly humiliated by a powerful crime family, the effect was the same. Marcus couldn't build stability or security anywhere, couldn't escape the consequences of that single decision to threaten Angela Roselli. The most disturbing part of Rebecca's research was what had happened to Marcus about 3 years after leaving Roselli's that night. He'd been found beaten severely in an alley behind a bar in Philadelphia, his injuries extensive enough to require weeks of hospitalization and leaving him with permanent damage, a limp from a shattered knee, partial hearing loss from head trauma, chronic pain that would plague him for the rest of his life. The police investigation had gone nowhere. No witnesses coming forward, no evidence pointing to specific perpetrators. The case filed away as another unsolved assault in a city with too many violent crimes and too few resources to investigate them all. But Rebecca had sources who told her the beating had been commissioned by someone connected to the Marchesi family, a reminder that Marcus's humiliation at Roselli's hadn't settled all accounts, that the disrespect he'd shown to Giovanni's widow required more permanent consequences. The timing was deliberate. Rebecca explained 3 years was long enough for Marcus to think maybe he'd gotten away with just losing his career. Long enough for him to start rebuilding some semblance of normal life, making the violence that much more devastating because it came just when he'd begun to hope the worst was behind him. It was calculated cruelty of the kind that organized crime specialized in punishment, designed to break someone psychologically as much as physically, to ensure they understood that certain sins didn't fade with time or distance. I sat there listening to Rebecca's account, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't entirely untangle. Part of me felt that Marcus had deserved consequences for his cruelty toward Angela, that someone who built a career on intimidating, vulnerable people shouldn't be surprised when he eventually encountered forces capable of intimidating him. But another part recoiled from the systematic destruction of a human being, the years of pursuit and punishment that seemed disproportionate to the original offence, the permanent physical damage inflicted 3 years after the incident, as if the Marchesi family operated on timescales that made human notions of closure and moving forward irrelevant. I asked Rebecca if she thought the punishment fit the crime, if Marcus's treatment was justified by what he'd done to Angela. Rebecca considered the question carefully before responding that justice was the wrong framework for understanding what had happened. The Marchesi family hadn't punished Marcus to right a wrong or protect society or teach a lesson about respecting elders, she explained. They'd punished him to reinforce their authority, to demonstrate what happened to people who disrespected those under their protection, to maintain the reputation that allowed them to exercise power without constantly having to resort to violence. Marcus was an example, a cautionary tale, someone whose destruction served purposes that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with systems of control and dominance that predated his birth and would continue long after his death. Rebecca's article, when it was finally published about 6 months after our conversation, caused significant controversy in both academic and policy circles. She documented extensively how organised crime families had become unexpected allies for some long-time residents and businesses resisting displacement, while simultaneously profiting enormously from other aspects of gentrification through money laundering schemes involving real estate transactions and construction projects. The Marchesi family featured prominently, their protection of Roselli's presented as a complex case study in how mob involvement in neighbourhoods could produce outcomes that appeared beneficial to communities, even while serving fundamentally exploitative purposes. Rebecca interviewed dozens of people, including Angela herself, who'd initially been reluctant to participate, but had eventually agreed to share her story. Angela's quotes in the article were characteristically nuanced, expressing gratitude for the protection she'd received, while also acknowledging discomfort with being indebted to criminals, recognizing that her restaurant's survival was an exception that highlighted, rather than contradicted, the general pattern of vulnerable people being exploited by powerful interests, whether criminal or legitimate. The article sparked debates about whether communities should accept help from organized crime in fighting displacement, whether mob protection was better than no protection, whether the ends justified means that involved violence and intimidation. I read Rebecca's article multiple times, each reading revealing new layers of complexity in situations I'd witnessed firsthand but hadn't fully understood at the time. She'd contextualized the Roselli's situation within broader patterns of urban development, organized crime evolution, and community resistance to gentrification. She'd interviewed urban planners who argued that the failure of legal systems to protect long-time residents and businesses from predatory displacement created vacuums that organized crime filled, not out of altruism, but because such interventions served their interests in maintaining neighborhood influence and demonstrating power. She'd spoken with former mobsters who explained the codes of honor and respect that had motivated Salvatore Marchesi's intervention, the ways that protecting people like Angela wasn't purely cynical, but reflected genuine values that coexisted with criminality in complicated ways. And she documented the costs of such protection, the way being under mob control meant reduced autonomy, potential involvement in money laundering or other crimes, association with organizations whose overall impact on communities was negative, even when specific interventions appeared positive. The article refused to provide simple answers or clear moral judgments, instead presenting the full complexity of situations where official systems failed and unofficial ones stepped in with their own agendas and methods. The response to Rebecca's article included, perhaps inevitably, increased law enforcement attention to the Marchesi family's operations. Federal prosecutors announced new investigations, suggesting they'd use the article as a roadmap for building RICO cases that would finally bring down the organization. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Rebecca's attempt to document how organized crime filled gaps in community protection had potentially set in motion forces that would eliminate that protection without addressing the underlying conditions that made such protection necessary. I worried about what this meant for Roselli's and other businesses operating under similar arrangements, whether removing mob protection would leave them vulnerable to the same development pressures that had threatened them originally. Angela, when I asked her about this concern, just shrugged with a fatalism that came from decades of navigating systems beyond her control. She said the restaurant had survived Giovanni's death and developer harassment and her own retirement, and it would either survive federal prosecution of the Marchesi family or it wouldn't, but she'd done everything she could do, and the rest was up to forces she'd never been able to influence anyway. Her acceptance was simultaneously wise and heartbreaking. The recognition that regular people caught in conflicts between organized crime and law enforcement had no good options, just different versions of vulnerability, depending on which powerful entity was currently dominant. The federal investigation progressed slowly, hampered by the usual challenges of prosecuting organized crime witnesses who recanted testimony, evidence that mysteriously disappeared, lawyers who exploited every procedural protection, and the fundamental difficulty of proving criminal conspiracy among people who'd spent generations learning how to insulate leadership from direct involvement in illegal activities. Salvatore Marchesi died during the investigation, officially of natural causes, though there were rumors about family members who might have accelerated his death to prevent him from becoming a cooperating witness. His funeral was a major event, hundreds of people paying respects to a man who'd been simultaneously feared and loved, whose death marked the end of a particular era of organized crime, characterized by old-world codes and neighborhood connections that younger generations were less interested in maintaining. I didn't attend the funeral but heard about it from people who did, who described the strange mixture of legitimate community members and obvious criminals, all gathering to honor someone whose life had contained profound contradictions. Family man and murderer, generous benefactor and violent enforcer, protector of neighborhood institutions, and predator who extracted tribute from those same institutions. Salvatore's death seemed to trigger succession struggles within the Marchesi organization, different factions competing for control, the unity that had characterized his leadership, fragmenting into more chaotic and unpredictable arrangements. Roselli's continued operating through all of this turmoil, the new owner maintaining his lease and keeping the restaurant running much as Angela and Giovanni had for decades. But the neighborhood around it kept changing in ways that made the restaurant feel increasingly anachronistic, a relic of a past that younger, wealthier residents had no connection to or understanding of. The businesses on either side closed and were replaced by upscale boutiques and wine bars. The demographic composition shifted toward affluent professionals, with different dining preferences and no loyalty to old Italian restaurants serving red sauce that hadn't changed in 50 years. Roselli's started struggling financially for the first time in its history, not because the quality declined, but because the customer base that had sustained it was increasingly displaced or deceased, replaced by people who saw the neighborhood's history as aesthetic background rather than living connection. The owner tried adapting, updating the menu with more contemporary options, renovating the interior to appeal to newer residents, but these changes alienated long-time customers without successfully attracting enough new ones to compensate. I watched this slow decline with sadness that was partly personal nostalgia and partly grief for what it represented, the erasure of community history and character, the transformation of neighborhoods into marketable lifestyles, the loss of places that had served functions beyond pure commerce. About 8 years after Angela's retirement, Roselli's closed permanently. The owner simply couldn't make the numbers work anymore, couldn't generate enough revenue to cover rent and expenses in a neighborhood where commercial real estate values had tripled. He announced the closure with a notice in the window thanking customers for their support, explaining that circumstances beyond his control had made continuing operations impossible, inviting people to a final night of service, where the restaurant would serve its classic dishes one last time before shutting down forever. That final night was packed, hundreds of people trying to fit into a space designed for maybe 80, former customers who hadn't been back in years, returning to say goodbye to a place that had been part of their lives for decades. Angela attended, now in her early 80s, and quite frail but determined to witness the end of what she and Giovanni had built. I saw her sitting at a corner table, surrounded by family, looking at the walls covered with photographs, the same red checkered tablecloths that had been there since the beginning, the familiar smell of tomato sauce and garlic bread that had defined the space for so long. Her face showed the weight of accumulated losses: her husband, her active role in the business, now the business itself, but also a kind of peace that came from knowing she'd fought as long and hard as she could, that the restaurant's ultimate closure wasn't a failure, but simply the inevitable conclusion of forces too large to resist indefinitely. The building that had housed Roselli's was purchased by a developer within weeks of the restaurant's closure. I watched over the following months as it was gutted and renovated, transformed from a working restaurant into high-end residential lofts that rented for more per month than most of the neighborhood's long-time residents earned in salary. The photographs came down, the kitchen equipment was sold off, the physical traces of 43 years of community gathering and family celebration were erased as efficiently as if they'd never existed. A small plaque was installed near the entrance, acknowledging that the building had formerly housed a neighborhood restaurant, a gesture toward historical preservation that was more insulting than commemorative because it reduced decades of life and work to a single sentence on metal. The new residents had no idea what the space had been, what role it had played in community life, what struggles had been fought to preserve it, what complicated arrangements with organized crime had kept it operating years longer than it would have survived otherwise. To them, it was just a cool converted space in a trendy neighborhood, authentic, exposed brick and high ceilings, a lifestyle choice rather than someone's life's work. I stopped walking past the building after it opened as residential space because seeing it produced emotions. I didn't know how to process rage at the injustice of displacement dressed up as development, grief for what had been lost, helplessness at being unable to prevent or even slow the transformation that was remaking the entire neighborhood into something unrecognizable. Angela died about 2 years after Roselli's closed, succumbing to complications from pneumonia that her age and declining health couldn't fight off. Her funeral was held at the same church where Giovanni's had been, attended by many of the same people, a community gathering to mourn someone who'd represented continuity and tradition in a neighborhood where both were increasingly rare. The Marchesi family sent representatives, despite their organization being weakened by federal prosecution and internal power struggles, respect for old connections and old codes, persisting even as the structures that had given them meaning collapsed around everyone. I attended the funeral and listened to eulogies that talked about Angela's kindness and resilience, her dedication to the restaurant and community, her dignity in the face of various threats and pressures. But what struck me most was what went unsaid, the complicated reality of how she'd survived as long as she had, the protection that had come from sources she'd never chosen but had accepted because survival required pragmatism over purity, the moral compromises that everyone in that church had made at various points because living in neighborhoods where power operated through multiple contradictory systems meant there were rarely clean choices, just different shades of complicity and different calculations about which devils to make deals with when angels proved unavailable or ineffective. The story of Roselli's, of Angela and Giovanni, of Marcus Bryant and Salvatore Marchese, has stayed with me as a kind of parable about urban life and community resistance, and the complicated relationship between crime and survival in neighborhoods that exist at the margins of legal and economic systems. I tell the story sometimes to people who ask about the neighborhood's history, about what it was like before gentrification transformed everything, about how communities fought back against displacement and sometimes won small victories, even if they eventually lost the larger war. The responses vary. Some people romanticize the mob protection, seeing it as evidence of community solidarity and code of honor that mainstream society lacks. Others condemn it as glorifying criminality and ignoring the harm organized crime does to communities, regardless of occasional protective interventions. Both responses miss the complexity, I think, the way that real situations rarely fit into clear moral categories, the way that survival often requires accepting help from imperfect sources because perfect solutions don't exist, and refusing all compromised assistance is itself a form of privilege that vulnerable people can't afford. Angela understood this in ways that people who've never faced genuine powerlessness often don't. She was grateful to the Marchesi family while also being clear-eyed about what they were, accepted their protection while understanding its costs, survived longer than she would have otherwise, even though that survival came with obligations and associations she'd never wanted. I still think about that Thursday evening when I sat at Roselli's counter watching Marcus Bryant terrorize an elderly widow, feeling my own cowardice and helplessness, not knowing that forces were already in motion that would transform the situation in ways I couldn't have predicted or understood at the time. I think about the role of witness in all of this. I'd been there for key moments, had watched events unfold, had borne testimony to struggles and victories and compromises that would otherwise have happened unseen and unrecorded. But what did my witnessing accomplish? Did it change anything, help anyone, serve any purpose beyond satisfying my own compulsion to observe and remember? These questions don't have satisfying answers. Maybe bearing witness is valuable regardless of whether it produces measurable outcomes. Maybe maintaining memory of what happened and how and why matters, even when that memory can't prevent similar situations from recurring. Or maybe I'm just rationalizing my own passivity, finding meaning in observation because I lacked courage for action, telling myself that remembering is important because I failed at preventing or changing what I remembered. The uncertainty haunts me, follows me through a neighborhood that keeps erasing its own history, that keeps replacing authentic complexity with sanitized narratives designed to make newcomers comfortable rather than informed, that keeps choosing development over preservation and profit, over community, because those are the values that structure our economic and political systems, regardless of what individuals might prefer. The building that housed Roselli's is now worth millions of dollars, a real estate asset that generates returns for investors who never met Angela or Giovanni, who've never tasted the red sauce that took decades to perfect, who don't know and probably wouldn't care about the struggles that occurred within those walls and the complicated forces that kept the restaurant operating as long as it did. The market value of that property is the only value that matters in contemporary calculations, the only metric that urban planners and developers and policymakers use when making decisions about what to preserve and what to sacrifice in the name of progress and economic growth. But there are other kinds of value that don't appear in real estate assessments or development pro formas, the value of continuity and memory, of gathering places where communities maintain connection across generations, of institutions that serve functions beyond profit maximization, of preservation that honors what existed rather than just what could be extracted. These alternative value systems seem quaint or naive in contemporary urban environments, romantic notions that don't account for economic realities and market forces that will transform neighborhoods regardless of whether existing residents want that transformation. Maybe that's true. Maybe resistance is futile, and all we can do is document what's being lost while it's being lost. Maintain memories that serve no practical purpose, except acknowledging that what disappeared once mattered to people who are also slowly disappearing from neighborhoods they can no longer afford or recognize. That's a depressing conclusion, a surrender to forces that perhaps could be resisted with sufficient organization and political will. But it's also honest about the scale of the challenge and the limitations of individual action in systems designed to concentrate power and wealth, regardless of community costs.